Act 4, New Approaches. In this final section, I'm going to bring things up to the present. There are a few interesting developments. The first is the arrival of queer theory in Mormon studies. Queer theory dates to the 1990s, and in the 2000s it starts to show up in a few papers in Mormon studies. It describes a diverse set of approaches, different from LGBTQ history, in that it's more theoretical. In the spring of 2011, Alan Michael Williams publishes Mormon and Queer at the Crossroads. This essay explores conflicting messages within LDS teachings on LGBTQ rights, when it both opposed same-sex marriage in the wake of Proposition 8 and also came out in support of other LGBTQ rights that display both wrath and mercy. It explores a theory of LDS teachings on homosexuality along these lines, as well as the context of shifting norms around sexual identity. Later that same year, in the winter of 2011 issue, my own article, Toward a Post-Heterosexual Mormon Theology, appeared. This was actually the first major article I ever published. I didn't know what to expect, but it ended up being a widely discussed piece, accessed tens of thousands of times. To this day, I still receive notes of appreciation about this article. There have been a number of responses and challenges to the project that I laid out, but I want to tell you that in the winter of 2021 issue of Dialogue, I've got an essay called After a Post-Heterosexual Mormon Theology, a 10-year retrospective. There are going to be a lot of details about the origins and the aftermath of the article that I've never told before. I'm not going to spoil them here, but I will say a few things. One was my own frustration that the pastoral approach to the topic, or focus on the causes of homosexuality, not that this wasn't important and probably more effective than my own, but that these were unsatisfactory to me. I had other theological questions that I felt were unanswered. So I set out to examine the link between Mormon theology, reproduction, kinship, and gender to see whether non-heterosexual sealings might be possible. All of my arguments were an attempt to lay out the problems that I thought needed to be solved, no matter the answers, and to propose possible solutions to those problems. I wanted to be clear that I was not advocating that my solutions were correct, nor that church leaders or members should follow my arguments. Rather, I wanted to raise critical questions about the best arguments that stood in the way of theologically affirming same-sex sealing and to explore their strengths and weaknesses. There are some other articles from this period that are working on setting LDS ideas in broader context. Wilfred de Koo writes in 2013, As our two faiths have worked together, Catholicism and Mormonism on human life ethics and same-sex marriage. This is a fascinating comparison, and he explains, quote, I analyze a number of factors that could ease the way for the Mormon Church to withdraw its opposition to same-sex marriage, at least as it concerns civil society, while the Catholic Church is unlikely to budge. The summer 2016 issue deserves special consideration. It's dedicated more than half to this topic, the first time in Dialogue's 50-year history up to that point with that much content in one issue. There are two scholarly articles on the empirical research on LGBTQ suicide in LDS contexts. That's less than a year after the November 2015 policy that raised the sanctions on LDS individuals who entered into same-sex marriages. Here's what they say. When we put these data together, it is impossible to know exactly how many suicides there are among Mormon youth and how many of these are related to LGBTQ issues. In large part, this is because data collected by the government on deaths, including suicides, do not generally indicate the sexual orientation of the deceased. Despite this fact, we have described above some compelling evidence that allows us to conclude that there is a significant problem and to make some reasonable inferences. The direct empirical evidence alone is enough to merit a public health response. It further noted that family acceptance or rejection was the single largest factor contributing to mental and emotional health of LGBTQ youth. There are two personal essays in this issue, one from BYU professor Ronnie Jo Draper and another from D. Christian Harrison on covenant keeping and boundary making. Both are worth checking out. There's also a really great photo essay by Kimberly Anderson, The Mama Dragon Story Project. The Mama Dragons are a support and advocacy group of LDS mothers of LGBTQ children. Each gorgeous photo is one of the Mama Dragons with a brief story of why they got involved with the group. Anderson photographed more than 80 members, and a selection of those are presented in this photo essay. The next really important article in this vein is Bryce Cook's Summer 2017 article, What Do We Know of God's Will for His LGBT Children? An examination of the LDS Church's position on homosexuality. It divides the question up into doctrinal, moral, and empirical perspectives. Cook's goal is to understand, to encourage empathy, and to encourage people to see current church teachings on homosexuality as incomplete. In this way, it has a lot in common with the pastoral approaches we've seen before. The analysis here is strong, and this division is a version of other theological traditions that argue from Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience to evaluate any theological claim. This essay asks some great questions and raises some pretty serious critiques about the problems with contemporary LDS teachings and practices. The longer this change takes place, he writes, the more we will lose gay people, their family members, their friends, and other sympathetic church members, particularly younger people who do not see same-sex marriage as a threat to society or a sin against God. I next want to note that Blair Ostler has written a number of pieces, from personal essays, poetry, to articles, that are worth noting. Her 2019 article, Queer Polygamy, is an innovative mashup that looks beyond monogamy as the only authorizing type of same-sex relationships. It really pushes the boundaries of what queer scholarship had done, drawing on contemporary polyamory to critique the limitations of heterosexual monogamy and putting that into conversation with the LDS tradition of plural marriage. Ostler imagines a new type of polygamy, queer polygamy, that sheds the patriarchal baggage of the 19th century version and its continuation in fundamentalist Mormonism, as well as thinking beyond its presumed heterosexuality. Winter 2020 has an essay that I believe is a first, written by Kit Hermanson about their experience as trans. Now, Dialogue had published other trans authors, both before and after transitioning, and we hope to see more, but this is a powerful explanation of some really key issues in how documents participate in a biodisciplinary political project. Most interesting essays on blood, biology, bodies, and religious ritual that I've read in a while, this one should really not be missed. Richly informed by practice theory and more than a personal essay, this article makes connections to LDS history, literature, theology, genealogy, and more by looking at birth certificates, baptism documents, marriage and death certificates, and beyond. Quote, documentation that supports the heteropatriarchal structure of both the church and state enforces its power and persuades us to work toward reform, recategorization, and recognition rather than disruption. The family tree, birth certificate, temple recommend, marriage certificate, and death certificate are all part of this cycle. And surely we can all, regardless of identity, find ourselves and stories like ours in the archive if we work hard enough. This theological and political question then is posed for us: how should we use the archive as we construct our own worlds around us? As queer people, what do we fight for? I also call your attention to a co-written piece by Bob Reese and Bill Bradshaw, both grandfathers of this movement, who write a long survey article hosted on the Dialogue website, LGBTQ Latter-day Saint Theology. It's a great overview of the main issues and history of scholarship. In spring 2021, the most recent issue that's just come out as of the recording of this podcast, there are 5 important pieces that I want to discuss. The first is Alex Griffin's Queer Mormon Histories and the Politics of a Usable Past. This is about vernacular history or popular historical tales rather than professional histories. It looks at all kinds of fun material from Instagram accounts to brand advertisements to see how these stories retell the past in order to comment on the present, or a usable past. Another article in this issue, The Theological Trajectory of the Family, a Proclamation to the World by M. David Huston, argues that we should interpret that text in its historical context and glean from it new possibilities. Drawing on feminist interpretive strategies, Huston reads the theological trajectory rather than the plain meaning of the document to discern principles that might endure beyond a narrowly heterosexual family. Taylor Kirby has an article, too, on variety of perceptions of God among Latter-day Saints that includes some analysis of LDS LGBTQ perceptions of God. Fascinating data here. Finally, John Gustav-WRATHALL, who we met before, writes a really powerful piece, Excommunication and Finding Wholeness. Wow, I love this piece for its ministry to those who are excommunicated by the church and who still believe. He tells his own heartbreaking excommunication story in 1986 and his journey since then. Quote, "There have been many times when my excommunicated status has felt burdensome, and when I have yearned to be able to be baptized and partake of the bread and water each week at sacrament. However, I firmly believe that I am currently where the Lord wants me to be, and I have felt reassurances through the Spirit that eventually all will work out so long as I remain faithful and attentive to its promptings." So we're seeing some really new directions in the scholarship. We seem to be done litigating some of the issues, like psychology and biology from before, and instead expanding the kind of scholarship we saw in the past. History, yes, but also more theology. We're also hearing more from queer voices, no longer writing anonymously as Solus once did some 40 years ago. And there are all kinds of experiences, from mixed orientation marriage to trans voices, and more that are coming into this space. What's missing? You may have noticed that these conversations have been, until pretty recently, dominated by men. Not exclusively, but largely. Further, lesbian histories are really absent from the scholarship, which focuses on gay men and the organizations they have largely controlled, like Affirmation. That's changing, but there's more to be done here. So that's it. And I'm proud, if I may say so, this Pride Month, of Dialogue's rich history in tackling this central issue in contemporary religious ethics. We're going to be taking a break for the summer, and we'll come back in the fall with fresh content on more dialogue topics. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and for taking the journey through Dialogue Journal, and for all of your support.